The essay writing guide will help you follow 8 different steps to writing your response to a DBQ or writing the document-based essay. The directions first state to read the background information and the essay question below, then follow the steps to write an essay based on primary and secondary sources that answers the question. Here's the background information. There were many changes in transportation and technology in the United States in the early 1800s. These changes influenced the way people lived and worked. Essay question. We will read the essay question in step 1. Step 1 is to read and analyze the question because we need to know what it is that we are going to be analyzing and what we are going to be writing about. So the first step is to read the question to yourself and then read it aloud. So you can read it silently to yourself. I'm going to read it aloud right now so that we can look at it together. And then step 2 of this step is to highlight the most important words or phrases in the question. Be sure to pay attention to dates, verbs, and adjectives. Check for words that tell you there is more than one side to an issue, such as the words however, but, though, and there may be other words. So as we read, we're going to look for keywords for what the question is trying to ask us. So using the documents, you will analyze them in step 4. So that tells me I am going to have some documents that I need to look at. Your answers to the document analysis questions. So I'm going to be answering some questions. And your knowledge of the early 1800s. So apparently I need to have some knowledge about the early 1800s to write a well-constructed essay that answers the following questions. So it's telling me what it is that I'm going to have to write. So the questions are, what kinds of changes in transportation and technology took place in the United States in the early 1800s? So it's asking me for kinds of changes in transportation and technology. And then it's also giving me a time period in the early 1800s. So when we're talking about what kinds of things, it's asking us for some kind of an explanation or to identify changes. Next part of the question, how did those changes influence the way people lived and worked? So how did the changes influence the way people lived and worked? So how did they influence? Next, how do those changes continue to affect our lives today? So it's talking about changes continuing to affect our lives today. Whereas up here, it's how they lived and worked in the past. Okay, so we did step 1 where we read and highlighted the questions to ourselves and read it aloud. We did step 2 on this part to highlight the most important words or phrases in the question. Now in this part, number 3, on the list below, circle the what the questions are asking you to do. You may circle more than one item. Does the question ask you to compare and contrast? Not really. It's asking you to look for things, the way people lived and worked in the early 1800s and how it affects our lives today. So it's a little bit of some contrasting. Is it asking you to explain? Yes, because it's asking you what kinds of changes, how did those changes influence, and how do the changes continue? So it is asking you to explain. So that is important to know what it's asking you to do. Does it ask you to describe? Yes, it asks you to describe because it says what kinds of changes. That is a way of asking you to describe something. Is it asking you to disagree or agree with a statement? No. Is it asking you to prove something? No. Number 4 is to rewrite the questions as sentences that show you understand what is being asked. And I would challenge you to write this out. In fact, I will demonstrate this for you, and you can use this since this is also your writing assignment. So you want to start with an I will statement. So I will, and just to make this easier to read, I am going to change the color for purposes of being able to see this better on this lesson. I will identify, actually I'm going to change this to I will describe changes in transportation and technology that took place in the early 1800s. Notice how I restated the question as an I will statement. Let's do the next part. How did those changes influence the way people lived and worked? I will explain how those changes influenced the way people lived and worked. And then the last I will statement for how do those changes continue to affect our lives today. I will explain how these changes continue to affect our lives today. Okay, at this point, you would want to show your sentences to an adult and discuss your understanding of these questions. So just to make sure that you understand what it is that the question is asking, this I will step helps make sure that you know what you are describing and explaining in your response.